Could you explain what I mean for our audience who don't are not familiar with the term
Oh,
eugenics
sure.
and sterilization and Tuskegee, these experiments with the people, I mean black bodies, but
Yeah,
how why there is a reason for the black people, Hispanic people, not to trust medical institutions?
sure. Well, eugenics was and is
Hmm.
the idea that we can improve the human race through selective breeding, just like we might with cattle or dogs and so on. And it had two sides: negative eugenics, which is preventing some people from reproducing, and positive eugenics, which was encouraging uh, superior specimens, allegedly, to reproduce. And it was a very, very popular idea on all sides of the political spectrum in the 19th and let's say the first half of the 20th century. And it was implemented. Um, in Nazi Germany, it was implemented. Certain people were encouraged to reproduce,
Hmm.
others were sterilized. Um, the Nazis were influenced by the United States. So eugenics began in Great Britain. It was exported to the United States. The Americans just ran with it, and the Nazis really looked. They greatly admired American racism, right? They, our extermination of Native Americans, our Jim Crow legislation, which became part of the basis for the racist laws instituted in 1935 in Nazi Germany, and so on. So eugenics, the idea, part of the idea, because there are different versions of it, was to weed out basically non-white people, right? And, make the world white. um, uh, and this was thought, some people thought, well, this is just going to naturally happen.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
People, supporters of colonialism, when whole peoples were exterminated, like the Tasmanians in Australia. But there were definite, programs of sterilization to to make sure
Hmm.
that,
Only the whites
that
exist.
it
Yeah.
happened. Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
Now,
Hmm.
running parallel to that was um, medical experimentation on people of color.
Hmm.
Um, Now, and actually, I'm saying let's revise that a little bit, because the language of race is so confusing.
Hmm.
Medical experimentation on those regarded as racial inferiors.
Yeah.
I say that because, of course,
Hmm.
in the extermination camps in Poland
Hmm.
in the 1940s,
Hmm.
there was medical experimentation with people with my complexion who
Hmm.
were regarded as members of the Jewish race.
Hmm.
Um, so there's a long history of that.
Hmm.
So experiments with the effects of radiation
Hmm.
in the United States.
Hmm.
Um, you mentioned Sims, the
Hmm.
obstetrician. He
Hmm.
did experiments on enslaved Black women
Yep.
without anesthesia,
Yep.
right? Basically cutting them open,
Hmm.
surgical experimentation.
Hmm.
The Tuskegee experiment was uh, a group of physicians found Black men with syphilis and refrained from treating them
Hmm.
to observe the course of the
Yeah.
disease, which of course
Yeah.
terminates usually in insanity and death.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
So they
Yeah.
just
And
let it roll on. So there's a
yeah.
long history of these sorts of things. And even more recently,
Hmm.
um, in the past couple of decades,
Hmm.
in Latin America, uh, Americans have been up to the same stuff.
Yeah. 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 I mean, experiment that when you develop a drug, you want to test it on bodies, what
Yeah.
happens. And then particularly, which I find in my research, that vaccine hesitancy among Black people and Hispanic people is that, well, if you have been treated that way historically and that trauma is, present in
Yeah.
you, Are you
Okay.
supposed to trust them? I mean, what
Yeah.
logical individual are supposed to? And then
Hmm.
what happens, the same rhetoric, is actually become racial, that, well, they're the uneducated, they're the, welfare mama and all of that. I mean,
Mhm.
so many things, we can find out.
Exactly.
I apologize to some of the questions. I mean, I particularly try not to take questions that might be deemed um, to be taken against. I mean, I'm not in a position to answer all the questions, so I only try to take questions that, as for that, I'm really sorry for that. Our a very respected older sister, Christina, is saying that I like the calm way Dr. Smith is speaking about an infuriating issue. How do you do that, David? I need to learn that because I get excited.
Well, I guess I'm used to it.
Mhm.
Uh, I mean, why is an oncologist calm about talking about cancer? Right? I think it's very important, actually.
Mhm.
There's plenty of room for outrage. Outrage is important.
Mhm.
But if we're trying to study something
Mhm.
um, and explain it, outrage doesn't work very well.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. I think as I'm getting older, I'm understanding that a bit more. In the fifth chapter, one of the chapters that really messed my head, and which I love about your writing, is that a lot of the chapters when I read, and again, I read your books again. For example, when I read The Most Dangerous Animal about 6 years ago, what it meant to me, and as I go, I revise. Oh, what does it mean on in humanity? What
Mm,
does it mean? Um, so it confuses me. So I want to come to that, but before that, I want to go to the eighth chapter where you talk about what does it mean to be human,
yeah. Yeah.
and you question. So David, please help us
Mhm.
understand what does it mean to be human and how the conceptualization of being human is connected to dehumanization in so
Okay.
many cases.
It's a great question, and this messes with a lot of people's heads because they
Mhm,
take the category of the human for granted.
mhm,
So if you ask um, most educated people, well, what is it to be human? They'll say, oh, science has shown us that. It's being a member of the species Homo sapiens. Now, if you actually look at the scientific literature, uh, that's not so obvious. The scientific literature sometimes says human as being a member of genus Homo, sometimes subspecies Homo sapiens sapiens, sometimes a whole bunch of other members of the human biological lineage. You can go on the Smithsonian website and it lists 21 species of humans. It's all over the place. And if we leave the scientific literature behind and just look at how the term is used worldwide, we find even more variation. So it's not uncommon for indigenous cultures to refer to themselves as the human beings or the people. And of course, by default, then no one else is is a human being. Um, this is well known. So what I, first of all, there's a question to be asked: why? Why isn't this straightforward? Well, there's a very simple reason for that. With respect to science, human is not a scientific term; it's a folk term. Uh, so when scientists, I mean, I wish every scientist like took philosophy 101 to understand some of these issues.
David, you also make a distinction between scientific term and folk term.
Exactly.
Could you also make a
Yeah,
distinction between
sure.
that too?
So suppose, I mean, my yard is covered with snow right now, but
Mhm,
in the springtime, weeds will pop up
mhm,
in the yard,
mhm,
and and there are a whole bunch of plants I would call weeds. Now, those weeds, all those plants I call weeds, don't really have any important biological similarities except for the fact that they're plants. And if someone came down from Mars, say, an alien, and was trying to study what weeds are, they'd be very, very confused unless they understood something about gardening, right? So what makes a plant a weed is just that it's a plant growing in a place we don't want it to grow. And the
Mhm,
very same
mhm,
plant, if it's growing out in the woods, it's not a weed. But if it's in
mhm,
my flower bed, it's a weed. So
mhm,
what makes a weed
mhm,
has to do with a way of life, human
mhm,
practices,
mhm,
cultural practices, ultimately. And that category, weed, it's a perfectly good category,
mhm,
but it doesn't map onto any scientific category, right? Um, so I think human is like that. Human is like weed. It's a perfectly good category, but it doesn't map onto any scientific category. So then how does it work? Well, a lot of philosophers want to say that being human is to have certain characteristics or capacities. So go back to Aristotle, the capacity for rationality, go to Descartes, the capacity for speech, and so on and so on and so on. That's a really bad approach because there are always people then who do not fit the description. Say severely cognitively impaired people who don't have the capacity for rationality. Does that stop them from being human? Of course not. How about people who can't speak? How about even dead people? Dead people are human. They're just dead humans, right? So this is a very problematic approach, and it leads to bad things because it excludes some members of us from the category of the human. We see this very strikingly, for instance, in the Nazi euthanasia program. So uh, after the war, there were, the Nazi euthanasia program began with the killing of mentally disabled children. Thousands were killed. And after the war, some pediatricians were charged with murder. And in their own defense, which was successful, they say, well, you can only murder human beings. The term murder doesn't apply to non-humans. And these children were not human. They were not human beings. In fact, one of these very distinguished pediatricians was interviewed in 1964 in the German magazine Der Spiegel, and he said exactly that. They're lumps of flesh. Okay, so that's not a good approach. I'm interested in trying to figure out what all of these notions of the human have in common. From the white supremacist who says only white people are human, to the anthropologist who says members of genus Homo are human, only members of genus Homo, to the indigenous tribe in South America. It says only the members of our group are human. And I think I understand it. Human means my kind, my essential kind. It means the us. That's what it means. Those who share our essence. So it's an immensely flexible notion because, of course, historically, we can include some people in our us and then we can exclude them. This is a porous, shifting boundary. So on that understanding of what human means, to dehumanize others is to exclude them from the us in a very, very fundamental sense. You can exclude people in a less fundamental sense. You could say, well, they're foreigners. So in that respect, they're not us, but they're in the same essential category. It's us in this very basic, essentialistic, fundamental sense.